Student vanished in 2015. 10 years later, principal opens forgotten locker and finds. The dust motes danced in the slivers of late afternoon sun, the only things moving in the silent, cavernous halls of Northgate High. For 40 years, Principal Thompson had watched them, a silent, swirling galaxy in his little kingdom of linoleum and sin. Now, on the eve of his retirement, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, a shroud woven from a decade of unspoken words. He ran a hand over his tired, lined face, the scent of floor wax and old paper, a familiar, cloying perfume. It was time to purge. Time to let go. His office was a mausoleum of memories, faded photos of championship basketball teams, plaques for academic excellence, a drawer full of confiscated contraband that told 1,000 stories of teenage rebellion. He was methodically shredding decade-old disciplinary records when his fingers brushed against it. A single tarnished brass key in the back of a drawer, attached to a faded yellow tag. The number was barely legible, 138. A cold fist squeezed his heart. Locker 138. He hadn't thought about that locker in years. Not deliberately, anyway. The mind had a funny way of walling off the things that festered. It had been sealed in the fall of 2015, under a thick coat of administrative red tape and collective denial. Ethan Miller's locker. Ethan. The name was a ghost on his tongue. A bright, quiet boy with a shock of unruly blonde hair and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of secrets. He'd been 17, a poet, an artist, a boy who seemed to float at the edges of the boisterous high school ecosystem, never quite a part of it. And then, one crisp October afternoon, he'd simply vanished. Walked out of school and into thin air. The police had called it a runaway case. His mother, a frantic, hollowed-out woman named Sarah, had insisted otherwise. She had stormed into this very office, her voice raw with a grief that was too fresh, too certain. He wouldn't run, she'd wept, her hands clutching a worn photo of her son. Someone took him. Something happened to him. Here, in this school. Thompson had offered platitudes. He'd spoken of teenage impulsiveness, of the pressures of senior year. He'd assured her they were doing everything they could. But in truth, he had done what all good administrators do. He'd managed the situation. He'd contained the potential panic, deflected the media, and quietly, efficiently, sealed locker 138, a small metal tombstone in the middle of B Hall. It was evidence, the police had said, but the case quickly went cold, and the locker became a forgotten footnote in the school's history. A decade, 10 years of dust motes dancing. Guilt, sharp and sudden, lanced through him. He'd failed that boy. He'd failed that mother. He'd let the story die, let the silence win. On his last day, with the sun setting on his long, unremarkable career, maybe it was time to finally listen to the silence. His joints protested as he pushed himself up from his chair. The key felt unnaturally heavy in his palm. The walk to B Hall was a walk through a time warp. The faded posters warning against the dangers of vaping were new, but the scuff marks on the floor, the faint smell of teenage sweat and Axe body spray were eternal. There it was, locker 138. Unlike the others, its blue paint was pristine, unknown by the graffiti of passing years. A thin layer of dust coated its top, but otherwise, it looked exactly as it had the day the maintenance crew had put a new lock on it and handed him the key. His hand trembled as he inserted the brass key. The lock was stiff, resisting him. For a moment, he thought of turning back, of leaving the past buried. What good could come of this? But Sarah Miller's face, etched with a mother's primal terror, flashed in his mind. He gritted his teeth and turned the key. The click was deafening in the silence. It sounded like a bone snapping. He pulled the handle, and the metal door groaned open, releasing a blast of stale, cold air. It smelled of decay. Not of food, but of time itself. Of moments. Left to rot, he peered inside. It wasn't empty. A single worn-out grey backpack sat at the bottom, slumped against the back of the locker like a defeated soldier. It was a JanSport, the kind every kid had. But this one felt different. It felt sacred. his heart hammering against his ribs. Thompson knelt, his old knees cracking in protest. He reached in and pulled the backpack out. It was heavier than it looked. The fabric was stiff, and a fine, almost invisible layer of mildew clung to the straps. He unzipped the main compartment, the sound echoing the finality of the locks. Click. Inside, nestled between a tattered copy of Slaughterhouse-5 and a spiral notebook filled with elegant, looping doodles, was a journal. It was bound in cheap, cracked faux leather, the kind of thing a teenager would buy at a mall kiosk. But it was the inscription on the first page that made the air leave his lungs in a ragged gasp. The handwriting was neat, precise, but held a tremor of urgency. My name is Ethan Miller. If you're reading this, it's because I didn't make it out. It's because he won. I want someone to know why. I want someone to know what he did to me. Thompson's vision blurred. The words swam before his eyes, a deathbed confession reaching out from a decade-old grave. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, the hallway tilting around him. He wasn't just a principal cleaning out a locker. He was an archaeologist unearthing a tomb. His shaking fingers fumbled through the backpack's front pocket. There was a crumpled pack of gum, a few stray pens, and something small and hard. He pulled it out. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, shaped like a heart. The kind a boy might give his first girlfriend, but there was no picture inside. He almost missed it. A tiny, almost imperceptible seam on the back. He pried at it with his thumbnail, and a hidden compartment sprang open. Tucked inside was a minuscule, tightly folded square of paper. It was yellowed and brittle, and he feared it would turn to dust in his fingers. With the painstaking care of a bomb disposal expert, he unfolded it. The handwriting was different. Messy, frantic, a desperate scrawl. He locked me in. B-wing storage. The air can't breathe. Please tell my mum I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. No, Thompson whispered, the sound a dry crackle in his throat. Oh God, no. B-wing storage. It was at the end of the hall, a small windowless room where they kept old desks and forgotten textbooks. It was right there. It had been right there all along. The boy had been suffocating, dying, just a few hundred feet from where his classmates were laughing and learning. A wave of nausea washed over him. He felt the sting of bile at the back of his throat. He had been here. He had walked this hall every day for 10 years, a ghost haunting the living, while a boy's final, desperate plea lay hidden behind a thin metal door. The weight of his failure was crushing, a physical pressure on his chest. He was complicit. His silence, his administrative tidiness, his willful ignorance, it had all been a shovel, helping to bury that boy. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the far end of the hall, near the main entrance. It was the sound of a heavy metal door swinging shut. Thompson's head snapped up, his body flooding with a primal animal fear. He wasn't alone. He scrambled to his feet, shoving the journal and the locket into the pockets of his jacket. He slammed the locker shut, the sound a gunshot in the stillness. Peeking around the corner, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, he saw a figure, a janitor, slowly, methodically pushing a mop bucket. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels was the only sound. Relief, weak and fleeting, washed over him. Just a janitor, working late. He was being paranoid. The horrors in his hand were making him see ghosts in every shadow. But as the figure drew closer, bathed in the long distorted shadows of the setting sun, the relief curdled into ice. The janitor was a man in his late 50s, with a stooped posture and a weary face. But the face, it was older, etched with new lines, the hair thinner and grayer. But it was a face he knew. A face he hadn't seen in 10 years. It was Daniel Albright. The chemistry teacher, Albright, the charismatic, popular teacher who had been Ethan's mentor. The one who had started an after-school science club that Ethan had adored. The teacher who had taken a special interest in the quiet, artistic boy. Teacher who had abruptly, inexplicably, resigned his position 2 weeks after Ethan Miller disappeared, citing a family emergency. He'd vanished as completely as the boy had, and now he was here. mopping the floors. His movements were slow, deliberate, each push of the mop a measured, patient stroke. But his eyes, even from this distance, were fixed on Thompson. They weren't the eyes of a janitor. They were the eyes of a wolf. He knows. The thought screamed through Thompson's mind. He knows I opened the locker. He knows what I found. A cold, greasy sweat broke out on his forehead. The hallway, once a familiar space, was now a trap, a hunting ground. The main entrance was behind Albright. The only other way out was through the gym, at the opposite end of the school. He had to move. Now, he turned and broke into a clumsy, terrified run, his dress shoes slipping on the polished linoleum. His breath came in ragged, painful bursts. Every shadow seemed to leap out at him, every echo of his own footsteps, a phantom pursuit. He fumbled for his cell phone, his fingers numb and useless. He had to call 911. He had to tell someone. The squeaking of the mop bucket stopped. In its place came a new sound. The soft, unhurried tread of footsteps. They weren't running, they were walking. A calm, steady, relentless pace. The pace of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to go. Thompson's office, it was closer. Then the gym, it had a lock, a heavy, solid oak door. He didn't dare look back. He burst into the main office, the familiar scent of coffee and photocopies, now laced with the metallic Thames of his own fear. He slammed the door to his private office shut, his hands shaking so violently it took him 3 tries to turn the deadbolt. The click of the lock was a small, pathetic sound against the vast, terrifying silence. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his ears straining. He could hear it now. The footsteps, slow and steady, crossing the tiled floor of the main office. They stopped right outside his door. Silence. Thompson held his breath. His world shrinking to the space of the room, to the wood of the door pressed against his back. He could feel the vibrations through it. He could feel the presence on the other side. A decade of secrets, of rot and decay, all converging on this single, terrifying moment. Then, a soft, almost gentle knock, 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 followed by a voice, a calm, reasonable voice, laced with a chilling, almost playful familiarity. "Arthur," Daniel Albright said, his voice muffled by the thick oak. "I know you're in there. We have so much to talk about." The journal in Thompson's pocket felt like a block of ice against his skin. The locket was a leaden weight, pulling him down into a dark, suffocating place. The note, "He locked me in." He was on the other side of the door. The monster from the story was real, and he was standing just inches away. Thompson squeezed his eyes shut, the image of that frantic, desperate note burning in his mind. The air can't breathe. He was a principal, an educator, a man of order and rules, but in that moment, he was just a terrified old man, trapped in a tomb of his own making, with the ghost of a dead boy, and the monster who had killed him. And the monster was knocking. The knock came again, louder this time, a sharp, impatient rap that vibrated through the wood and into Thompson's bones. "Arthur, don't be childish. Open the door. You're the principal. You're supposed to set an example." Daniel Albright's voice was a thing of terrifying contradiction. It was smooth, educated, the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex formula, but underneath it lay a current of something cold and sharp, like a shard of glass in honey. It was the voice Thompson remembered from a decade ago, the voice that had charmed parents and inspired students, the voice that had lured Ethan Miller into a web of trust and mentorship. Thompson stumbled backward, away from the door, his hand clutching the phone he'd finally managed to pull from his pocket. His fingers were slick with sweat as he tried to dial 911. His thumb kept slipping on the screen. 9-1. He stabbed at the screen again. 1. The call connected. 911. What is your emergency? A calm female voice asked. Before Thompson could speak, a new sound came from the door, a metallic scratching. Albright was picking the lock. "There's a man. He's trying to get into my office," Thompson whispered, his voice a hoarse croak. "At Northgate High. My name is Arthur Thompson. He's Daniel Albright." "Sir, Are you in a safe location? No, he's picking the lock, he's going to kill me. He could hear the tumblers clicking, one by one. It was a sound of methodical, patient destruction. Sir, stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers to your location. Can you tell me what he looks like? What he looked like? He looked like a decade of nightmares made flesh. He looked like every parent's worst fear. He was a teacher here, Thompson stammered, backing away until his legs hit the edge of his mahogany desk. He left when a student went missing. Ethan Miller. I think he killed him. I found proof. The final tumbler clicked into place. The doorknob began to turn. They're on their way, sir, the dispatcher said, her voice tight with urgency. Stay calm. The door swung open. Daniel Albright stood there, framed in the doorway, the janitor's grey uniform seeming like a grotesque costume. He held a set of lockpicks in one hand, and a small, sad smile played on his lips. He looked from the phone in Thompson's hand to his face, his eyes full of a kind of weary disappointment. Really, Arthur, he said, his voice soft. After all these years, you called the police on me. I thought we were colleagues. He took a step into the room, and the door swung shut behind him, closing with a soft, ominous click. He wasn't holding a weapon, but he didn't need one. His presence was the weapon. It filled the room, sucking the air out, a black hole of menace. What do you want, Daniel? Thompson's voice was a thin thread. What I want. Albright tilted his head, a gesture Thompson remembered him using in front of a classroom, as if pondering a student's particularly insightful question. I want what you found. The journal, the locket, the little artifacts of a life I so carefully curated and erased. He took another step, his movements unhurried, graceful even. He was a man transformed. The stooped, weary janitor was gone, replaced by a predator in his element. This school was his kingdom too. His hunting ground thus was the Daniel Albright who had first arrived at Northgate in 2012. He'd been a breath of fresh air. A mid-career teacher who'd left a prestigious private school on the East Coast to, in his words, make a real difference. In the public system, he was handsome in a rugged, intellectual way, with a passion for chemistry that was infectious. The kids adored him. The parents trusted him. He'd started the Science Olympiad team, the astronomy club. He was the kind of teacher who stayed late, who offered extra help, who saw the potential in the kids who were overlooked. Kids like Ethan Miller. Ethan was a boy made of glass, fragile, transparent, with a world of intricate, beautiful things sealed inside him. His father had left when he was 6, a phantom presence who sent birthday cards with crisp $20 bills and no return address. His mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs, a waitress at the local diner and a cleaner at the hospital. She loved her son with a fierce, desperate love, but she was exhausted, worn down by the sheer effort of keeping them afloat. She saw Ethan's quietness, his artistic soul, and she worried. She wanted him to be happy, but she didn't know how to speak his language, so Ethan retreated into his sketchbooks, which were filled with fantastical creatures and dark, swirling landscapes, into his poetry, which spoke of loneliness and a yearning for connection. He was a ghost in the crowded halls of Northgate, a boy who was seen but never truly noticed, until Mr. Albright arrived. Albright saw him. He didn't just see the quiet kid in the back of the class. He saw the intricate mind, the hungry intellect. He praised Ethan's lab work, his insightful questions. He read his poetry and told him he had the soul of a romantic. He told him he was special. For a boy starved of a father figure, of any kind of validation, Albright's attention was like water in a desert. It was everything. The mentorship began in the classroom, with extra credit projects and after-school lab sessions, but it soon bled beyond the school walls. Albright's father, he'd told Ethan, had been a chemist too, and had left him a house full of books and old equipment. He invited Ethan over on weekends to see his personal library. Sarah had been so grateful. She'd met Mr. Albright at a parent-teacher conference. He'd shaken her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, his eyes full of earnest sincerity. "Your son is a once-in-a-generation mind, Mrs. Miller," he'd said. his voice resonating with a passion that seemed so genuine. "It's a privilege to teach him," she'd cried on the drive home, tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Someone finally saw her boy. Someone understood him. She had trusted Albright completely. She had encouraged the weekend visits, packed them lunches, felt a surge of pride when Ethan came home, his eyes shining, talking animatedly about molecular bonds and quantum physics. He was finally coming alive. But there was another student who watched this blossoming relationship with a growing sense of unease. Her name was Maya. Maya was a ghost of a different sort. She wasn't quiet, she was invisible. She was the girl who got straight B's, who was never in trouble, who was never on a team or in a club. She was utterly, completely average. Her power, if you could call it that, was her ability to blend in. She saw everything because no one ever saw her. She was in Albright's AP chemistry class with Ethan. She saw the way. Albright's eyes would linger on Ethan, a strange, possessive gleam that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She saw the way. He would brush against him in the lab, a hand on his shoulder that lasted just a second too long. She saw the way Ethan, once so withdrawn, now seemed to orbit the teacher. His face a mixture of adoration and a subtle, almost imperceptible fear. She saw the other things too. The things no one else noticed. The way Albright's smile never quite reached his eyes. The flashes of irritation that would cross his face when another student demanded his attention. The way he would subtly isolate Ethan, dismissing his few friends, making him feel as if their bond was a special, secret thing that no one else could possibly understand. Maya had her own secrets, her own broken past. Her father was a police officer, a man of rigid rules and a short, explosive temper. Her home was a place of tiptoes and held breaths. She knew what monsters looked like when they wore the masks. Of respectable men, she recognized the predator in Daniel Albright, because she lived with a tamer version of the same species. She tried to warn Ethan once. She'd caught him after class, by the lockers. "He's weird with you," she'd mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. Mr. Albright, Ethan's face had hardened. The open, shining boy of the last few months vanished, replaced by the old, defensive ghost. "You don't know what you're talking about," he'd snapped. "He's the only person who gets me. You're just jealous." He'd turned and walked away, and Maya had felt a familiar sting of shame and impotence. He was right. Who was she? A nobody, a ghost. Why would he believe her? But she kept watching, and what she saw began to terrify her. She saw Ethan starting to change. The light in his eyes was dimming again, replaced by a haunted, exhausted look. He was losing weight. He had dark circles under his eyes. He stopped writing poetry, stopped sketching. The joy of his intellectual awakening was being replaced by a heavy, suffocating burden. In the present, in the suffocating silence of his office, Thompson clutched the phone. The dispatcher's distant voice, a lifeline to a world that suddenly felt a million miles away. Albright was stalking toward him, his movements fluid and serpentine. "You have no idea what it took, Arthur," Albright said, his voice a low confessional whisper, "to find a mind like his, a perfect vessel. Pure, untouched, full of a brilliant, desperate loneliness. Do you know how rare that is?" He stopped in front of the desk, looking down at Thompson not with anger, but with a kind of academic curiosity, as if Thompson were a specimen under a microscope. He was a masterpiece. Albright continued, his eyes glazing over with a rapturous nostalgia. "We were exploring the very nature of matter, of existence. He had a gift for seeing the patterns, the hidden architecture of the universe, but he was fragile. The outside world, with its noise and its vulgarity, it was starting to damage him. To pull him away from me. You were his teacher," Thompson croaked, the words tasting like ash. "I was his everything." Albright's voice suddenly sharpened, the honeyed tone cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "I was his father, his mentor, his God. I gave him a purpose. I was shaping him into something beautiful, something eternal, and he was going to throw it all away." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the town beyond. A girl. Can you believe it? Some vapid little thing from his art class. He was talking about college, about leaving. He was going to abandon our work. Abandon me. After everything I'd given him, the memory hit Thompson like a physical blow. Sarah Miller, in his office, a few days before Ethan vanished. She'd been worried. He seems distant, she'd said. He's been seeing a girl, Maya, I think. She seems nice, but he's scared of something. He told me he wanted to quit Mr. Albright's science club. When I asked why, he just started crying. Maya, the girl from the art class, the name from Ethan's frantic final note wasn't his mother's, it was Maya's. Tell Maya I love her. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of such grotesque horror that Thompson felt his stomach heave. He tried to leave you, Thompson said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength from the dawning terrible clarity, and you couldn't let that happen. Albright smiled, a slow, terrible stretching of his lips. He belonged to me. You don't just let a masterpiece walk out of the gallery, you preserve it. You make it permanent. The siren started. Then, a faint, distant wail that grew steadily closer. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Thompson's terror. Albright heard them too. His eyes flickered toward the window, a brief flash of annoyance crossing his face. But the smile never left. It seems our time is short, he said, his voice returning to its calm, reasonable tone. A shame. I was enjoying our reunion. Give me the journal, Arthur. I'll die first, Thompson spat, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. Albright sighed, a sound of theatrical wariness. So dramatic. You were always a bureaucrat, Arthur, never a man of vision. You see a dead boy, I see a legacy, an idea preserved in its purest form. He's not dead, he's eternal, he's with me, always. He reached into the pocket of his janitor's uniform and pulled something out. It wasn't a weapon, it was a key. A small silver key on a simple metal ring. You know, he said, dangling the key in front of Thompson's face. For 10 years, I've kept this school clean. I've watched generations of mindless children walk these halls. I've mopped the floors, emptied the trash. All to stay close. To be near my greatest work, the place where he reached his final, perfect state. He gestured with the key toward the wall behind Thompson's desk. The B-wing storage closet. His final crucible. Where the superfluous elements were burned away, and only the pure essence remained. The sirens were louder now, screaming through the night. Red and blue lights began to flash against the windows of the office, painting the room in strobing, frantic colors. They're here, Daniel, Thompson said, his voice trembling with a desperate triumph. It's over. Albright chuckled. A low guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of his being. Over, oh Arthur, it's just the beginning. He lunged, not at Thompson, but at the wall beside the desk. His movements were impossibly fast. He inserted the key into a tiny, almost invisible lock near the floorboards. A lock disguised as an electrical outlet. He turned it. There was a low grinding sound, and a section of the bookshelf next to the desk swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening, a hidden passage. This old school is full of secrets, Arthur, Albright said, his face illuminated in the flashing police lights. He looked like a demon, his eyes burning with a triumphant madness. And I know all of them. He backed into the darkness, his smile, a final taunting slash of white, in the shadows. He's not the only ghost in these halls, he whispered. And then he was gone. The bookshelf swung shut, clicking back into place with a sound of chilling finality. Seconds later, the office door burst open, and 2 uniformed officers stormed in, guns drawn. Police, don't move. They found Arthur Thompson, an old man on the verge of collapse, standing alone in his office. Clutching a cell phone, and staring at a solid, unremarkable wall, the ghost of a whisper still echoing in the empty, silent room. The 24 hours that followed the discovery were a blur of flashing lights, crackling radios, and the cold, sterile language of a police investigation. Northgate High, once a symbol of suburban tranquility, was transformed into a sprawling, yellow-taped crime scene. Thompson gave his statement a dozen times, his voice growing hoarser with each retelling. The words feeling more inadequate, more absurd. He handed over the journal and the locket, watching as they were sealed in plastic bags. Ethan's final, desperate words, now labeled as evidence. Exhibits A and B in a decade-old horror story. The police were thorough, professional, but Thompson could see the skepticism in their eyes. A secret passage, a janitor who was actually a long-lost murderous chemistry teacher. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, not a police report in a sleepy Pennsylvania town. They searched his office, tapped on the walls, examined the bookshelf. They found nothing. No hidden lock, no secret door. Daniel Albright, like Ethan Miller before him, had simply vanished. The news broke the next morning. It wasn't a story. It was an explosion. A 17-year-old vanished in 2015. Principal finds his final words in forgotten locker. The headlines screamed from every news site, every cable channel. The school was besieged by a swarm of media vans, their satellite dishes pointing at the brick facade like accusations. Reporters with predatory smiles and sympathetic frowns stalked the perimeter, ambushing students and parents, their questions like vultures picking at a fresh wound. For the world, it was a sensational, tragic story. But for two women, it was the reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. Sarah Miller saw the news on a small television in the corner of the diner where she still worked. The morning rush was on, the air thick with the smell of bacon and coffee. A customer pointed to the screen, his voice loud. "Hey, Sarah, isn't that your boy? The one who ran off?" Sarah looked up, and there he was. Ethan's senior year photo, the one she kept on her nightstand, broadcast for the world to see. His smile was hesitant, his eyes full of a light that had long been extinguished. And then the words scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Final message found. Believed to be a victim of foul play. The coffee pot slipped from her hand, shattering on the tiled floor. The sound was lost in the sudden, roaring silence. In her head, they were saying he was dead. They were saying it was murder. All the years of clinging to a desperate, foolish hope that he'd just needed space. That he'd gotten amnesia, that one day he would just walk back through the door. All of it crumbled to dust in an instant. The truth was a black wave she had been running from for 10 years, and it had finally, brutally, caught up to her. She ripped off her apron and walked out, leaving the chaos behind her. She drove, her hands clenched on the steering wheel, her vision blurred by tears. She refused to let fall. She didn't go to the police station. She didn't go to the school. She went to the one place she had avoided for a decade. She went to Daniel Albright's house. It was a small, unassuming bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. The paint was peeling, the lawn was overgrown, a monument to a decade of neglect. The police had already been there. A single strip of yellow tape was stretched across the front door, a flimsy barrier against a decade of secrets. Sarah tore it down. She kicked the door, the wood splintering around the lock. She kicked it again and again, her grief and rage erupting in a raw, primal scream. The door flew open, and she stumbled inside. The house was a time capsule. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine gray snow covering the life that had been abruptly abandoned. Books on chemistry and philosophy were still stacked on the coffee table. A mug sat by the sink, a dark ring of ancient coffee at the bottom. It was as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment and never come back. She moved through the house like a wraith, her heart a cold, dead stone in her chest. She was looking for something, anything, a piece of her son, a clue to his final moments. In the spare bedroom, she found it. The bed was neatly made, but on the nightstand was a sketchbook. Ethan's sketchbook. Her breath caught in her throat. She sank onto the dusty bed and opened it. The first few pages were filled with his usual drawings, mythical beasts, intricate patterns, the faces of strangers he'd seen on the bus. But then the drawings changed. They became darker, more frantic. There were sketches of chemical formulas, of beakers and test tubes, and then there were portraits of Albright, dozens of them. In some, he was smiling, the charismatic teacher. In others, his face was distorted, his eyes black pits of rage, his mouth twisted into a cruel sneer. They were drawings of a boy trying to understand his God, and realizing he was a devil. The last drawing made her gasp. It was a sketch of a room. A small windowless room, filled with old desks and boxes. And in the corner, a figure, small and hunched, its face a mask of terror. Underneath it, a single shaky word. Help it, was the storage closet, B-wing, the place from the note. Her son had drawn his own tomb. Meanwhile, across town, Maya was living her own nightmare. The news report had felt like a physical assault. Ethan's face on the screen, the mention of a note, the re-emergence of the name Daniel Albright, all ripped open the scar tissue she had so carefully built over her own guilt. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was a 30-year-old graphic designer with a sleek apartment, a successful career, and a carefully curated life that kept the past at a safe distance. But now the past was here, screaming from her laptop, demanding an audience. Her first instinct was to hide, to delete her social media, to change her number, to disappear just as she had done in high school. She had built a new life on a foundation of silence. What would happen if she started talking now? Her father, now a retired police captain, called her. His voice was gruff, devoid of its usual bluster. Maya, I saw the news. About that Miller boy. They're saying Albright is a suspect. I know, Dad, she said, her voice small. There was a long pause. You were right, he said, the words sounding as if they were being pulled from him with pliers. Back then, you tried to tell me about him, about the teacher she had. A week after Ethan vanished, driven by a gnawing sense of dread, she had gone to her father. She had sat in his armchair, smelling the familiar scent of gun oil and Old Spice, and she had told him everything. About Albright's lingering hands, his possessive gaze, the fear she saw in Ethan's eyes. Her father had listened, his face a granite mask, and then he had dismissed it. It's a crush, Maya, he'd said, his voice laced with a weary paternalism. The man's a good teacher. The boy is emotional. Don't make trouble, you have no proof, it's just a feeling. Don't make trouble, the mantra of her childhood. She had obeyed, she had stayed silent, and the guilt had been her constant companion ever since. I'm going to go talk to the detectives. Dad, she said, a sudden, surprising resolve hardening her voice. I'm going to tell them what I know. Good, he said, and for the first time in her life, she heard something in his voice that sounded like pride. It's the right thing to do. But as Maya drove to the station, a creeping fear began to take hold. Albright was out there. He had vanished from a locked room. He was a ghost, a monster who could walk through walls. What if he came for her? What if, after all these years, he decided to silence the one person who had seen the truth? Her fear was not unfounded. Daniel Albright was not a ghost. He was a man of meticulous planning and infinite patience. The secret passage in Thompson's office was one of several he had discovered and cultivated over his years of janitorial service at the school relics of an older building. Forgotten service tunnels from the Cold War era. He had navigated them with the ease of a rat in a maze, emerging from a storm drain 2 blocks away from the school. Melting into the night, long before the first police car arrived. He was not hiding in some dingy motel. He was in a clean, sterile, extended-stay hotel suite, paid for in cash under a false name. He sat in a minimalist armchair, watching the news reports on a large flat-screen TV, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He wasn't panicked. He was invigorated. The discovery of the journal was not a setback. It was a curtain rising. For 10 years, his masterpiece had been hidden, unappreciated. Now, the world would finally see his work. They would see Ethan's genius, his fragility. They would see the power he had wielded, the legacy he had created. But there were loose ends. Thompson was a fool, a bureaucrat. The police were plodding and unimaginative. But Sarah Miller, she was a problem. Her grief was a volatile, unpredictable chemical. And Maya was the witness. The girl with the knowing eyes, The one who had almost spoiled everything a decade ago. He could not allow them to tarnish the narrative. He could not allow their messy, emotional perspectives to contaminate the purity of his creation. He picked up a burner phone. He dialed a number. Sarah was still in Albright's house, clutching the sketchbook to her chest, when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but some instinct made her answer. "Hello, Mrs. Miller," a voice said. A calm, familiar voice that made the blood freeze in her veins. "I hear you've been redecorating my home. I hope you found what you were looking for." It was him, Albright. "Where are you, you bastard?" she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with a decade of pent-up rage. "Where is my son? What did you do with his body?" "His body is irrelevant," Albright said, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a small child. "His mind, his soul, his essence, that is what matters, and it is safe with me. But I'm worried about you, Sarah. Your grief is so loud, so unseemly, it's distorting the story." "I'll see you in hell," she whispered. "Perhaps," he said with a soft chuckle. "But not today. I'm calling to offer a piece of advice. For your own well-being, stop looking. Let the police do their clumsy work. Go home, grieve quietly. Do not speak to the media. If you do, if you insist on making this a spectacle, I will be forced to release other materials." "What materials?" Ethan was a prolific writer, Sarah, not just of poetry. He kept a very detailed digital diary on his laptop, a laptop that, fortunately, I have in my possession. He wrote about everything: his fears, his confusion, his feelings for me. Things a grieving mother might not want the world to know. The narrative could shift so easily, from a tragic victim to a troubled, confused boy in a relationship with his teacher. Do you understand what I'm saying? The threat was vile, insidious. He was threatening to posthumously smear her son, to twist the horror into a sordid scandal, to poison the memory of the boy she had lost. He would turn her victim into an accomplice. "Stay away from me," she stammered, the fight draining out of her. "I will," Albright said. "As long as you stay quiet, the choice is yours, Sarah." The line went dead. Sarah sank to the floor, the sketchbook falling from her numb fingers. She was trapped. To get justice for her son, she would have to risk the public destruction of his memory. Albright wasn't just a murderer. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling the strings of her grief. The conflict had escalated. It was no longer just about finding a killer. It was a war for the truth, a battle for the soul of a dead boy. And the antagonist was growing, bolder, more cruel, his shadows stretching longer, threatening to plunge them all into a darkness from which they might never escape. The week that followed was a slow, grinding torture. Albright's threat had worked. Sarah Miller retreated into a shell of silence, her face a blank mask of grief, whenever a reporter managed to get past the police cordon outside her small house. She refused all interviews, her silence fueling speculation and feeding the very narrative Albright had threatened to create. Whispers began to circulate online, dark threads on conspiracy forums. Was the teacher really a monster, or was this a love affair gone wrong? What was the mother hiding? Albright, from his invisible perch, was winning the war of perception. Maya, too, felt the chill of his influence. After giving her statement to the police, a detailed, emotional account of her observations from 10 years ago, she found her life under a microscope. Her name was leaked to the press. She was the witness, Ethan's secret girlfriend. Her photo was splashed across tabloids. She was hounded, followed. The locks on her apartment door suddenly felt flimsy. Every shadow in the parking garage seemed to hold a figure. Her carefully constructed life was unraveling, and the fear was a constant metallic taste in her mouth. She had done the right thing, but it had made her a target. The official investigation was hitting a wall. Albright had vanished without a trace. His financials were clean, his digital footprint non-existent. The police divers searched the reservoir behind the school. The canine units scoured the woods. They found nothing. The secret passage in Thompson's office remained a phantom, a figment of a terrified old man's imagination. The case was growing. cold again, buried under the weight of passing time and a lack of evidence. The media began to lose interest, moving on to the next bright, shiny tragedy. The outrage was fading, replaced by a dull collective amnesia. It was Thompson who refused to let it go. Placed on administrative leave, he was a man adrift. His 40-year career had ended, not with a gold watch and a round of applause, but with a police escort from a crime scene. His kingdom had been revealed to be a tomb. His legacy was not one of education, but of failure. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Ethan's journal sat on his bedside table, a constant, damning reminder. I want someone to know why. He spent his days in a self-imposed exile, poring over old yearbooks, student records, anything and everything from 2015. He was looking for a pattern, a mistake, a loose thread in Albright's perfectly woven tapestry of deception. He interviewed old colleagues, former students. They all said the same thing. Albright was a brilliant teacher, a mentor, a friend. Thompson was chasing ghosts. He was ready to give up. He was sitting in his darkened study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the setting sun casting long, funereal shadows across the room, when his eyes fell on a box in the corner. It was a box of old videotapes, labeled school board meetings. For years, every meeting had been dutifully recorded, a monument to bureaucratic procedure. It was junk, useless, but something made him get up. Some final, desperate flicker of intuition. He pulled out the tape for October 2014, a year before Ethan vanished. It was the annual budget approval meeting, a famously dull affair. He dusted off an old VCR from the closet, hooked it up to his television, and pressed play. The image was grainy, the sound tinny. He saw himself, 10 years younger, his hair darker, his face less lined, droning on about funding for the athletics department. He fast-forwarded through hours of monotonous presentations. It was useless. He was about to eject the tape when a name caught his attention, and finally, his younger self was saying, "We have a proposal from Mr. Daniel Albright of the Science Department for the installation of an upgraded security and ventilation system in the B-Wing storage closets to protect sensitive chemical supplies." Thompson sat bolt upright, the whiskey forgotten. He rewound the tape, his heart pounding. There, on the screen, was Daniel Albright, standing at the podium. He was charming, articulate, his face a mask of earnest concern. "As you know," Albright was saying, his voice smooth and persuasive, "we store a variety of volatile chemicals for our advanced placement labs. The current ventilation is inadequate, and the locks are frankly substandard. For a modest investment, we can install a state-of-the-art, digitally controlled system. It would allow for remote monitoring of air quality and temperature, and the doors could be sealed with electronic locks, accessible only by a unique digital key. It's a matter of student safety." The board had been impressed. They'd praised his initiative, his foresight. The motion had been passed unanimously. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, settled over Thompson. A digital lock, remote monitoring of air quality. He locked me in the air, can't breathe. It wasn't a simple lock, it was a death chamber. A tomb he had convinced the school board to fund. Albright hadn't just killed Ethan, he had used the system, the very bureaucracy Thompson revered, as his murder weapon. And he, Arthur Thompson, had signed the purchase order. His hands shaking, he began to search through his old files, a frantic, desperate archaeology of his own complicity. He found the invoices, the blueprints from the installation company, and then he found the user manual for the system. It was a thick, technical document, full of schematics and programming codes. He was about to toss it aside as incomprehensible, when a small folded pamphlet fell out from between the pages. It was a marketing addendum for an optional feature. The Viper system, remote audio-video surveillance. It was an upgrade, a way for an administrator to monitor the contents of the storage unit from a secure, password-protected web portal. A web portal. Thompson's mind raced. Albright was a ghost, but his ghost needed a signal. He needed a way to access his system. He needed the internet. He called the one person he knew might understand, Maya. She answered on the first ring, her voice wary. "Hello, Maya, it's Arthur Thompson." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know how he did it. He controlled the lock, the air, everything, remotely. Through a web portal, he built a trap, and we paid for it." He could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "A web portal? Does it still exist?" "I don't know," Thompson said. "The company that installed it went out of business years ago. But if the server is still active somewhere, if we could find it, we'd need a URL, a login," Maya said, her designer's mind immediately seeing the problem. "It could be anything, I know," Thompson said, his voice heavy with desperation. "But he's arrogant, he's a narcissist. It would be something personal, something meaningful to him." There was a long silence on the line. Then Maya spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan told me something once. He said Albright was obsessed with a particular chemical compound. He called it the perfect molecule. Symmetrical, stable, but capable of bonding with almost anything. He said it was a metaphor for the perfect mind." "What was it called?" Thompson asked, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. "Something, benzene. No, that's not right. Fullerene. That was it. A buck, Mr. Fullerene. C60, C60. Thompson typed it into his browser. C60.com, nothing. C60.net, nothing. He tried every variation. He was about to give up when Maya spoke again. "Wait," she said. "He was also a classicist. He loved quoting Marcus Aurelius. He told Ethan that true power was about controlling one's own inner world, their inner citadel. He called his lab, his special place with Ethan, the citadel." Thompson's fingers flew across the keyboard. He typed www.c60citadel.net. He hit enter. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a page loaded. It was stark white, with a single black login box in the center. Above the box was a geometric logo that looked like a stylized soccer ball. "A Buckminster Forlorn. I'm in," Thompson whispered, his voice trembling. "I found it. It needs a password," Maya said. They spent the next hour guessing. Ethan's birthday, Albright's name, chemical formulas, Latin phrases. Nothing worked. The site threatened to lock them out after 3 more failed attempts. "We're thinking about this wrong," Maya said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's not about him, it's about his victim. It's about possession." What was the first thing he did to control Ethan? Thompson thought back. The praise, the mentorship, the poetry. He read his poetry, he said. He told him he had the soul of a romantic. Who was Ethan's favorite poet? Thompson scrambled for the journal. He flipped through the pages, past the dark sketches and frantic notes, to the very back. There, on the last page, Ethan had copied a stanza from a poem. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, the mighty, and despair." Shelley Thompson said, "Ozymandias. Try it." Maya urged. Thompson typed it into the password box. Ozymandias. He hit enter. Access granted. The page that loaded was a nightmare. It was a simple dashboard, with temperature gauges, oxygen level readings, and a single ominous button labeled Seal Door. But on the right side of the screen was a small black window. A video feed. The feed was dark, but not completely. It was illuminated by a faint, ghostly light. The light of a cell phone screen. And it was a live feed. The camera was positioned in the corner of a small, dark room, a basement, and in the center of the room, sitting in an armchair, was Daniel Albright. He was looking directly at the camera. He was smiling. He knew. He had known they were trying to get in. He had been waiting for them. Then, he did something that made Thompson's blood run cold. He reached over and clicked a mouse. On a large monitor next to his chair, a new window popped up. It was a file directory, a folder labeled Ethan, and inside the folder were dozens of video files. Albright clicked on the first one. The date on the file was October 23, 2015, the day Ethan disappeared. The video filled the screen. It was from the camera in the B-Wing storage closet. The quality was grainy, but the image was clear. Ethan was inside, his back to the camera. He seemed to be looking for a book on a shelf. Then, the door slammed shut. The sound was horribly loud. Ethan spun around, his face a mask of confusion. He ran to the door, pulled on the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Mr. Albright," his voice was small, confused. "Is that you? This isn't funny." He began to panic, his breathing growing ragged. He banged on the door, his cries for help growing more and more desperate. And then, a voice came through. A small speaker in the wall. It was Albright's voice, .com, patient, serene. Asterisk, "It's okay, Ethan," the voice said. "This is just the next stage of our work. We are going to purify you. We are going to remove all the distractions, all the attachments. You will become eternal." The video was a recording of a boy being tortured to death. His slow, agonizing descent from confusion to terror to a final horrifying acceptance. It was all there, every cry, every gasp for air. Albright had recorded it all. He had kept it. He had watched it. This wasn't just a murder, it was a snuff film. Thompson felt a guttural sob escape his lips. This was a level of evil he couldn't comprehend. Maya was openly weeping on the other end of the phone. Then Albright looked back into his own camera, his eyes boring into them through the screen. He spoke, his voice calm and clear, as if he were in the room with them. "Now you see," he said, his smile widening. "Now you understand the beauty of it. The purity. And now, you are part of it. You are my audience." He clicked his mouse again. On his screen, a new window popped up. It was a live stream. He was broadcasting his own video feed, and the video of Ethan's final moments, to the world. A link appeared on the screen, a simple URL. "I think it's time the world saw my masterpiece," Albright said. "Don't you?" He was doxing himself. He was confessing. He was showing the world his snuff film, live. The stakes had just shifted from a hidden crime to a public, viral atrocity. The tension wasn't just at its maximum. It had exploded. The full, monstrous conspiracy was laid bare. And it was being live-streamed for the entire world to see. The internet did not just react, it detonated. The link Albright shared, an obscure address on a dark corner of the web, was suddenly everywhere. It spread like a virus through social media, whispered in chat rooms, and blasted across news tickers. Live, confession of a killer. The Ethan Miller tapes. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching. Then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. An entire planet, united in a silent, horrified communion, was gathered around a digital campfire, watching a monster perform his magnum opus. The screen was split into a horrific dip. On one side, the grainy, decade-old footage of a teenage boy dying, his desperate gasps for air, a ghostly soundtrack. On the other, the crisp, high-definition live feed of his killer, Daniel Albright, sitting in his sterile basement, his face a mask of serene, godlike arrogance. He was a conductor, presenting his symphony of cruelty to a captive global audience in her cluttered, dusty living room. Sarah Miller saw the link pop up on her son's memorial page. Her hands trembled as she clicked it. The image of the storage closet filled her screen, and she heard him. She heard Ethan's voice, his panicked cries for Mr. Albright. A raw animal sound tore from her throat, a sound of grief, so profound it was almost silent. For 10 years, she had imagined his final moments, but the reality was 1,000 times more brutal, more intimate. She was watching her son's murder, an uninvited guest at his execution. But through the agony, a cold, hard clarity began to form. The world was watching with her. There would be no more whispers, no more victim blaming. There was only the truth, stark and irrefutable. Playing out on a million screens, across town, Maya watched from her sleek, minimalist apartment, her hands clenched into fists. The fear that had paralyzed her for a week was burned away by a rage. She saw Ethan's face, contorted in terror, and she saw the monster who had done it, preening for his webcam. She had been a ghost for too long. She opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't a witness anymore, she was a weapon. The 911 dispatch centers were overwhelmed. The FBI's cybercrime division, tipped off by a frantic Arthur Thompson, was in a desperate race against time. They had the feed, but Albright was using a chain of proxies and relays that bounced his signal across the globe, a digital ghost in the machine. They were trying to trace it, but he was a master, always one step ahead. It was Maya who gave them the key. While the FBI's best minds were trying to crack the network from the outside, Maya was looking at the source code of the web portal itself. It was elegant, complex, but she was a designer. She understood structure, architecture, and she understood the man who had built it, an arrogant man. A man who would leave a signature. Buried deep in the commented-out code, a digital footnote. No one was ever meant to see. She found it. A single line of text, property of DA Acquisitions LLC, registered agent 124 Willow Creek Dr. Blackwood, PA. It wasn't a digital address, it was a physical one. An LLC he had set up years ago, a shell corporation, with a registered address in a sleepy town 100 miles away. The basement wasn't in some remote, untraceable bunker. It was in a house they could find. She called the FBI tip line, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the operator's panic. "I have his location," she said. His location. The information rocketed up the chain of command. Within minutes, a tactical unit from the FBI's Philadelphia field office was scrambled. Sirens screaming as they tore down the interstate. Helicopters were diverted, their searchlights preparing to converge on a single, unsuspecting house in the suburbs. On the livestream, Albright was narrating, his voice a calm, academic drone over the horrifying sounds of Ethan's last breaths. "You see, the moment the panic gives way to acceptance," he said to his silent, global audience. "The moment the body understands what the mind refuses to. It's a moment of absolute purity. The ego dissolves. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." He was so engrossed in his performance, so captivated by his own evil, that he didn't notice the faint, distant sound of sirens, but his audience did. In the chat rooms and comment sections, the tone shifted. The horror was still there, but now it was mixed with a new, bloodthirsty anticipation. "They're coming for you. Nowhere to run. Burn in hell." The mob had turned. The first sign of trouble for Albright was a flicker in the lights. Then the feed from his own webcam stuttered for a second. The tactical team had cut the power to the neighborhood block. He was running on a battery backup, but he was isolated. The ghost was being forced into a physical body. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He looked away from the camera, off-screen, as if listening, and then he heard it. The distinct thump-thump of helicopter blades, growing closer. For the first time, the mask of serene confidence cracked. A flash of something primal fear, surprise shot through his eyes. He had been so in control, a god pulling the strings from his digital heaven. He had never imagined they would find his sanctuary. He looked back at the camera, at his audience of millions. His smile was still there, but it was strained now, a rictus of defiance. "It seems we have some uninvited guests," he said, his voice a little too loud. "But the performance must go on." He reached for the mouse, his intention clear. He was going to play the final agonizing minutes of the tape. He was going to force the world to watch the light leave Ethan's eyes. But before he could click, the world outside his basement exploded. There was a deafening crash from upstairs, as a battering ram smashed through the front door. "FBI, get down on the ground." The commands were distorted, but unmistakable. Albright jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. The camera feed tilted wildly. For a moment, all the audience could see was a patch of ceiling and Albright's legs as he scrambled away from the desk. Then, a second explosion, this one much closer. A flashbang grenade shattered the basement window, erupting in a blinding white light and a deafening concussion. Albright screamed, a high thin sound of pure animal terror, stumbling backward, clutching his eyes. The live feed became a chaotic canvas of flashing lights, swirling smoke, and the dark, fleeting shapes of tactical officers descending the stairs, their laser sights cutting crimson lines through the haze. "On your knees, hands behind your head. Now." The camera, still rolling, captured the cinematic, ignominious end of Daniel Albright. He was no longer a god. He was a pathetic, disoriented man in a grey jumpsuit, blinking away tears, his hands zip-tied behind his back. An officer's boot was planted firmly in the center of his back, grinding his face into the cold, concrete floor. He looked up, one last time, his eyes finding the webcam. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The look of a predator who has suddenly, inexplicably, found himself in a trap. He had become his own specimen. The live feed, which had been broadcasting his confession and his crime, was now broadcasting his capture. The hunter had become the hunted, and his downfall was being witnessed by the entire world. A federal agent stepped in front of the desk and with a single, swift motion, slammed the laptop shut. The screen went black. The silence that followed was deafening. In living rooms and offices, in bars and bedrooms across the globe, millions of people stared at a blank screen, their minds reeling. They had just witnessed a public execution of justice, a real-time exorcism. In his study, Arthur Thompson let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 10 years. He slumped back in his chair, the tension draining out of him, leaving him weak and hollow. It was over. The ghost that had haunted his halls for a decade had finally been caught. Sarah Miller was on her knees, her body racked with sobs. But these were not the tears of grief. They were tears of catharsis, of a terrible, painful release. She had seen her son's killer brought low, his arrogance shattered, his face ground into the dirt. It wasn't justice, not yet. But it was vengeance. And in that moment, it was enough. And Maya, sitting in the glow of her monitor, closed her own laptop. She had faced the monster. She had found his lair. She had guided the sword of justice to his heart. The invisible girl had become the hero of the story. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and, for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel afraid. The public exposure was total, the payoff explosive, a poetic twist of fate delivered live to a global audience. The cinematic climax was complete. The trial of Daniel Albright was a formality, a piece of legal theater whose conclusion was never in doubt. With a confession and a videotaped murder broadcast to 500 million people, the verdict was swift and merciless. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. He was sent to a supermax facility, a concrete box from which his particular brand of evil would never again see the light of day. The world, having consumed the spectacle of his capture, quickly moved on. The Ethan Miller tapes became a morbid piece of internet history, a cautionary tale whispered about in the darker corners of the web. But for those at the heart of the storm, the silence that followed the verdict was more profound, and in some ways, more difficult than the noise had been. 1 year later, on a crisp October afternoon, eerily similar to the one on which Ethan had vanished, a small group of people gathered on a grassy hill overlooking a quiet cemetery. They weren't at a specific grave. Ethan's body, as Albright had so coldly stated, was irrelevant. He had disposed of it years ago, a final act of desecration that denied his family even a place to mourn. Instead, they had planted a tree, a young oak, its leaves just beginning to turn the color of fire. A small, living monument to a life cut short. Sarah Miller was there. The lines of grief were still etched on her face, but the frantic, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, settled sadness. She no longer worked at the diner. The money from a civil suit against the school district had allowed her to quit, to simply be. She spent her days volunteering at a center for at-risk youth. Her own tragedy channeled into a quiet determination to protect other mothers from the same fate. She approached the tree and gently touched one of its leaves, a gesture of infinite tenderness. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was its own eulogy. Arthur Thompson stood a few feet away, leaning heavily on a cane. The ordeal had aged him 20 years. He had officially retired, leaving Northgate High under the cloud of his failure. But in the months since Albright's capture, he had found a new, quiet purpose. He had used his own money to establish a scholarship in Ethan's name, The Ethan Miller Memorial Scholarship for the Arts. It was a small act of atonement. A way to ensure that Ethan's name would be associated, not with his horrific death, but with the creativity and passion he had embodied. He met Sarah's gaze, and gave a small, respectful nod. It was a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual loss, their shared history. Maya stood beside him. The media storm had eventually subsided, and she had fought hard to reclaim her life. She'd left her corporate design job and now taught art therapy at the same youth center where Sarah volunteered. She worked with quiet, withdrawn kids, kids who reminded her of Ethan, kids who saw the world through a different lens. She showed them how to channel their ghosts into color and shape, how to turn their pain into something beautiful. She had found her voice, not in speaking, but in helping others find theirs. They stood in silence for a long time. The only sound, the rustle of the autumn leaves in the breeze. 3 survivors, bound by a single tragic event. Their healing was incomplete, a mosaic of broken pieces glued back together. The scars would always be there, pale raised lines against the skin of their memory. But they were no longer living in the shadow of a monster. They were living in the memory of a boy. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thompson cleared his throat. He pulled a worn piece of paper from his pocket. It was a page from Ethan's journal, one he had photocopied before handing it over to the police. "I wanted to read something," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If that's all right." Sarah and Maya nodded. He unfolded the paper and began to read. It wasn't a poem about darkness or despair. It was a simple, unfinished piece, a fragment of a thought from a boy who had still, even then, been capable of seeing the light. "They say the universe is made of stardust." Thompson read, his voice trembling slightly. "That we are all just constellations of forgotten suns. Sometimes, I feel so small, a single dim star in a sky full of blazing galaxies. But even the smallest star casts a light. And sometimes, that light can travel for 1,000,000 years, across an ocean of darkness, just to reach a single pair of eyes. Maybe that's the point, not to be the brightest star, but just to shine." He folded the paper, his vision blurred by tears. The words hung in the air, a final, poignant message from the boy they had lost. His light, for a time, had been brutally extinguished. But here, on this quiet hill, in the lives he had unknowingly touched and transformed, it was shining once more. It had traveled across a decade of darkness, and it had finally reached home. They stood together as the last sliver of the sun disappeared, leaving a lingering, emotional echo of a boy who had just wanted to shine. The air was cool, the silence peaceful. The haunting was over. The healing had begun.